Hello, nerds for Yang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Now with this campaign, bang, dang, is and true. Come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Haha! Max Ghenis is in the house from the UBI Center. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Max, I had the privilege of getting a little preview of your deck with a number of amazing charts. So I think if folks are in the Nerds for Humanity mood and you guys want to see some data, you better put on your seatbelts and strap on your chin straps, because this is going to be an amazing ride. Before we get into looking at the data and the analysis that you've been doing on basic income, maybe we could just give a quick introduction to the Nerds for Humanity Nation on who is Max Ghenis.
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited to share some of the charts with you. I think we got connected on Twitter through a mutual, and you requested some data. I looked at some of your videos, and there's so much data that you put in, so I thought I'd save you a little bit of work. But yeah, I'm looking forward to going through that. Yeah, so my name is Max. I've been working on UBI analysis for a couple of years, and interested in the idea for probably 7 or 8 years. I'm currently an economist. I'm studying at MIT, and I'm finishing that program. Actually, like finals are this week, so that's exciting. And before that, I worked at Google, as you mentioned in the header. So I think that experience really showed me what the future of technology and the labor market could look like. When I was at Google, I was a data scientist. I started working on the HR team, so essentially looking at the labor supply of Google employees and how we select them and how we retain them, help them grow. And then I worked on the product side at YouTube, working especially on emerging markets. So I think the combination of those two things, kind of labor economics and seeing how emerging markets, developing economies are really approaching economic growth, got me really interested in this idea of how do we build something that's sustainable, both from a development perspective and also in developed countries like the US.
Yeah, so I remember, it's before Yang came on the scene, UBI, was certainly far from a mainstream idea. When you decided to leave Google and pursue this area of research, what was the reaction from like friends and colleagues? I'm curious.
Well, a lot of them had heard me talk about UBI for a while, so I think in some sense they weren't super surprised. And I think in general, I just realized that economic analysis was something I was more interested in than technology, data science. I learned a lot, and I was really grateful to be able to make those kind of contributions. But ultimately, I realized, looking at what are the kind of interventions we can do as a society to really improve social welfare, reduce the stigma that comes attached with being poor in this country, in every country. And UBI kind of was the most salient policy. And I feel it was kind of neglected too. There have been a lot of people who have been very interested in UBI for a long time. But I think the economic analysis hasn't always matched the kind of passion. So I felt like I could maybe fill a void. There have been actually a lot more people since I left Google who've done more of this kind of work. There's the Jane Family Institute has hired some researchers to look more at various aspects of UBI. Economic Security Project has done work. So I'm really glad that this is a growing area. But I think there's a lot more work to do to figure out how do you fund it? What's the impact of UBI compared to other policies, not just in a vacuum, but we often talk about all these potential reforms that could reduce inequality, reduce poverty. And I think UBI is worth throwing in the mix anytime we're having that discussion.
And what does life look like after you get that shiny new degree from the Institute?
Well, I think I'll be home like everyone else in the world right now. But it's actually worked out kind of well. I'm hoping to grow the UBI Center and continue to push out more research. Looking to actually bring on an intern or two to contribute to that. And I'm working mostly with open source tools. I think this is one of the differences between the UBI Center and most kind of think tanks is I'm pretty committed to sharing all of the research, all the fundamentals, all the code that goes into my analyses. And I'm using research from other folks and software that is called the Open Source Policy Center and Policy Simulation Library. So I'm continuing to work with them, and I can do all of that remotely because we're kind of fundamentally an open source community. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. I always love working with people in person, so I'm as disappointed as anyone who's kind of stuck at home, but think I'll be able to continue the momentum there.
And why do you think it's unique that you're open sourcing all of your research and analysis, and other organizations don't do the same thing? What's the rationale behind that choice that people make?
I think it's a couple things. So one is that if you look at the big think tanks, things like Brookings Institution, Tax Policy Center, or groups of that caliber, they're often working with data sets that are not public, actually. So there are, and the most common public data set for this kind of analysis is the current population survey produced by the census every year. But there's also tax data that either you have to pay for from the federal government, or they just make you sign some notes saying you can't share this because it contains potentially identifiable information. I think you can get pretty close to what they're doing without that kind of proprietary data. And actually, the Policy Simulation Library is working on ways to make that even better. But that's one reason. Another is, I think, just technically, most economists don't work with things like GitHub. So it's not part of the, I think that's changing, and that's a great thing. But it's not part of the curriculum today. And I think three, sometimes it's kind of your secret sauce, what you're doing behind the scenes. So they are businesses of some sort. So I think that's the smallest piece of it, but I do think even those kind of groups are having more incentives. Now funders are wanting more things open source. So we'll see more of this in the future, but I want to sort of leapfrog them.
Love it. Well, we are going to get to your deck, man, because there's so many cool slides in there. Before we do that, the OCD part of me is wondering, is it possible to close that door behind your shoulder?
Yeah, sure.
I've been
You'll
wanting to
see why I had it open in a second, actually. Yeah, I've got this microphone. It was kind of being obscured.
Oh, I see what you were doing. Well, I think it works great.
If you're cool with the microphone, I'm all set.
I've got mine in the shot too, so we're good. We're good.
Awesome.
All right. So Fred the Felon is asking, what is the website? Fred, it's ubicenter.org. And when did you start UBI Center, Max?
I started it, I think maybe a year or a year and a half ago. And that was just kind of setting up the organizational elements, getting it registered. And then the big kind of launch was putting out the analysis of Andrew Yang's Freedom Dividend.
Oh,
I think I did that maybe 8 months ago, somewhere around there.
Awesome. All right. And your mission is to inform a robust debate about UBI. And you'll be putting more time into it, I'm guessing, once you wrap up at MIT.
Yep.
And what were you studying at MIT? Was it economics or policy or both?
Yeah. So formally, the program's called Data Economics and Development Policy. So it's a new program. It's basically development economics. That's a master's, their first economics kind of master's. And it was really nice timing, actually, because it was kind of created by the folks who just won the Nobel Prize for their work in development economics. And they've actually been very enthusiastic about cash transfers and UBI. So Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, they won the prize with Michael Kramer. And they've done a fair amount of research showing that as lots of development economists have, showing that cash transfers solve a lot of problems, and especially right now, they can be deployed more quickly without potential bureaucracy and exclusion errors like missing people that you often get with other kinds of assistance.
Cool. Well, let's dig, because you were kind enough to share. Would you mind if I shared my screen and shared the slides?
Sure.
Or were there only certain ones that you want to focus on?
No, yeah.
All right, let's do it. Here we go. I feel like I'm back at work sharing some slides. Here we are. Let's start with the outline, and maybe we'll let you narrate it. I'll advance the slides for you, and then I might chip in with some questions and commentary with each slide.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I sort of broke these into 4 different sections. The first one is about how we think about poverty, how economists think about inequality, and also progressiveness. How progressive is your tax code or your transfer code, and how does that play into the progressiveness of the overall system, overall redistribution? And then programs. So things like, what do the existing programs do? What are the potential improvements that UBI can do on top of those programs? And then I put in a couple slides on UBI, the analyses I've done around the freedom dividend, and also a different kind of UBI, which is maybe more out there. And then how UBI can play into the COVID-19 debate.
Wow, this is gonna be great, man. I need to warn you, I was in the middle of dinner, so I brought my dessert. I might be having a little Oreo cheesecake from time to time. But that's there's nothing better than dessert and charts in my life. So
absolutely.
Before we move on to the next slide, Max, the progressivity has been talked about a lot. I remember AOC in particular was saying this is a very regressive policy. What's your general sort of way to kind of respond to assertions from progressives that, hey, this is a Trojan horse to help the rich?
Yeah, I think you need to look at the progressiveness of the whole system. So it is true that compared to AOC's, for example, her 70% marginal tax rate on incomes over 10 million, UBI and the freedom dividend, the tax sources from that are more relatively regressive. They're still actually progressive on the whole. And I have a chart on that in here. But if you compare what we have, the US actually has the most progressive tax code of the entire OECD. So of all developed countries, we are kind of alone in having really relying on very steep, relatively, they're low. All the rates are pretty low, and that's the problem. But marginal tax rates do increase with income a fair amount, and we don't have a VAT, right? I think Andrew Yang talked about this a lot. The fact that we just can't raise enough revenue for generous assistance programs, things that AOC would want, things like Medicare for all, elements of the Green New Deal maybe. Those all cost money, and there's just not enough revenue if you only tax billionaires, for example.
Did you say that, oh, by the way, Kachama has a super chat PowerPoint for the win. So, you've come to the right place, Max. This
Excellent.
This is a small niche on YouTube, but there are people who love this stuff, and I'm so glad to have you here. One question about the progressivity, I was surprised by your statement that the US is more progressive than other kind of OECD countries, because I guess the perception or the narrative out there is like, well, Europe taxes like crazy, and the US is the land of the free, and how do you reconcile that perception versus what you were saying, that actually we're more progressive than most other countries?
Well, those are both true. So Europe has much higher taxes than the US, but they're flatter. So they don't increase, the rates don't increase with income much. They rely on VAT. And if you look at even the income tax rates of the middle class are pretty close to what the top rate pays in countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden. In the US, a middle class person just doesn't pay very much tax. And that's a problem because it means we can't raise enough revenue to give them this kind of services that your average middle class person gets in the Nordic countries. So their overall system is much more progressive in terms of they take your market income distribution and they reduce it quite a bit to the inequality falls a lot because of redistribution. The US does not reduce inequality the same way because we rely mostly on the tax code for our progressiveness.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next slide, shall we? Well, it looks like you've got your first chart here. Let's go straight to the chart.
Yeah. I mean, basically,
what's
this is a
this
chart
thing?
of the poverty rate in the US using two different measures. And actually, I think the more people get into this kind of analysis, it's probably worth talking a little bit about these two different measures because you might hear about the official poverty rate. That actually doesn't include transfers. It doesn't include taxes. So if you could have a UBI of $20,000 a person, and it would not reduce the official poverty rate at all. So back in, I think, 2011 or so, probably whenever this chart starts, yeah, maybe 2009, the Census Bureau created what's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, so SPM. And that includes taxes, transfers, cost of living, so housing costs are adjusted there. And you can basically see we've dropped the poverty rate a couple percentage points over a decade or so. And this actually, I'm sure this will go up this year, but probably in 2019, it was going to fall even more through economic growth. But considering the economic growth we had, that's a pretty meager fall in the poverty rate. So I don't think we should say things have gotten worse or they haven't gotten better at all, but they just haven't gotten better as much as I think they could have if we had more programs kind of in the style of UBI.
Yeah, so it looks like maybe across 9 years of really strong economic growth, the poverty level only went down like 20%-ish, roughly.
Yep.
And so your point is like, man, if we can only make a little dent in it with that kind of unprecedented economic growth, then this sort of poverty will unlikely kind of get much lower unless we kind of change the system. Is that fair?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. And I have a question from Trumper for Yang, who's saying about VAT replacing income tax. Do you think there's a world where we could rely entirely on VAT to just get rid of income tax, or what's your position on that?
Yeah, it's possible. I don't think it would. I think it would have to be higher than 15% to replace the current income tax, especially if you exclude staples, which some other countries do not. And they, I think in general, we have something like a 28% tax to GDP ratio. It's more like 40% in Europe. And Europe, some of those countries have 28% VATs or so. And they have an income tax and other types of taxes. So we could just do, maybe something like a 40% VAT could fund a small UBI plus our existing operations. Realistically, the more you concentrate, it's a question of empirics. I think you'd need a study to figure this out. My hunch is if you rely on just one type of tax, there's going to be a lot of incentive to evade or avoid that one type of tax. So the more you kind of diversify your taxation portfolio, the more you can deter evasion and avoidance.
Yeah, one of the selling points of the VAT during the Yang campaign was that it was harder to evade and avoid. Do you have any sense of how much evasion and avoidance still happens with the VAT?
Yeah, it's definitely true. Compared to a retail sales tax, there's a lot of evidence that VAT does reduce avoidance and evasion. And income is avoided and evaded a lot too. I just think if we get into unprecedented, 40, 50% VAT territory, then people are going to figure out, for example, the advantage of a VAT is you basically have to report who you bought things from and who you sold things to. So if you're a kind of a middleman, you're not producing things from scratch, but you're not selling them to customers either. You cannot evade your VAT without also coordinating with everyone else in your supply chain
Right.
to avoid it. So, but if you have really high VAT, you could have kind of individual supply chains that are all evading it together, coordinating so that they can do that. And I think if you kind of diversify, you don't have as much of that problem.
All right. Let's move on to the next chart.
Yeah, so this basically shows, I'm not sure if the heading got cut off, but let's see, I'll pull it up. Yeah, so basically this is showing what I was mentioning before. We have very progressive taxes. And what the blue chart, the blue line shows is that's a share of income paid by the top or earned by the top 10%. And the red is a share of tax burden faced by the top 10%. So kind of the difference of these two bars shows how progressive your tax code is. And the US has the biggest difference in bars, kind of by a good amount. So, and there are other ways of measuring tax progressivity. This is from data from the OECD economists themselves. And they have a more comprehensive measure of tax progressivity, which shows that the US is the most progressive of the entire OECD.
Yeah, so just to make sure I'm looking at this correctly, let me zoom in here for the folks that can't see it as clearly. So if you're in the top 10% in the US, you have 30% of the country's income, but you are bearing 45% of the tax revenue. Is that correct?
Yep. That's
So
right.
that would be sort of a Republican's nightmare, right? It's like, oh my God, the people who are making generating this income are actually bearing a bigger part of the pie. It's not fair. Would that be a criticism that some people would have?
Yeah, I think that's a common criticism. This excludes things like state sales taxes and other ways that people pay into the system, but it does include payroll taxes and income taxes. So yeah, I think it's true. I mean, basically this shows that we have a progressive tax code. And
yeah,
almost half of it is paid by the top 10% federally.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so if you were, I don't want to get too political, but if there are Bernie folks who are thinking like, hey, we need to hold the rich people's feet to the fire more, I think this chart would say like, well, actually, the rich are bearing a pretty heavy burden relative to other countries, and this might not be intuitive to a lot of progressives.
Yeah, I think that's true, and especially if you compare it to Sweden, for example, the middle line there,
Yeah.
where basically it's even, right? They're earning about a quarter of income and they're paying a quarter of taxes. They're still paying a lot of taxes. I mean, if you're rich in Sweden, your tax rate is very high, probably higher than the US, I think, in the top 10%.
Yeah.
But the difference is that everyone else is also paying a lot of taxes. So when we're talking about funding new important public services, I think there's interesting political economy questions of why that is. I think you could tell a story that everyone feels like they're in the same boat because they're all contributing a similar amount, and then they're all benefiting from it too. So the US, for example, the means test a lot of their welfare programs a lot more than Sweden does. So when you raise revenue from everyone, you can give it back to everyone, and the net effect of that is going to be more progressive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the nuance there is the Europeans, they pay higher rates in general, but everybody pays similarly high rates.
Yeah.
Whereas the US, we pay lower rates, but the difference between the rich and the poor and the rates that they actually pay is also quite divergent.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Let's look at the next one.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is basically how much taxes we raise as a share of GDP. Average for the OECD. Yeah, I think it's close to 40%. And we pay only, I should have this memorized. Yeah, 24%.
24.3.
2008 or
Yeah.
So, or 2018, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's quite a bit lower. So we just can't raise enough revenue when we only have progressive kind of tax.
Yeah. Wow. We have almost almost half the rate of France. And I guess the argument is, well, when you don't have that much tax revenue, then you can't provide as many services. Although I remember in the 1980s, there was a strong argument that no, actually, the lower you make the rate, the more revenue you can capture. The Laffer curve that was very popular at the time.
Yep.
Does that? By the way, did that ever come up at in grad school when you guys were looking at policy? Is that just a complete crock, or is there some evidence for lowering taxes to increase total revenue?
The Laffer curve does exist. I don't think even the Warren economists, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, would object to the fact that that exists. So yeah, I took a public finance class. We talked about it. In general, I think most, the U.S. is definitely on the left side of the Laffer curve, so we could continue to raise taxes without reducing revenue. But it depends on the type of tax too. For example, tariffs in general constrain economic growth so much that you can actually often raise more overall revenue by cutting tariffs. So you're going to cut tariffs. You might lose some revenue from the tariffs, but you're going to make it up from other revenue, maybe from the corporate tax or income taxes, things that go up because economic growth improves.
No, that's interesting because
I'm not sure if like France is on the left or right side of the Laffer curve, and they're pretty high up. I think it does depend on the structure of the tax too. A VAT is a pretty efficient tax compared to, again, like a tariff.
Yeah, that's interesting in that if you look at the U.S. in the last few years, I think we've raised tariffs and cut income taxes. And your argument is like, oh, well, if you're raising tariffs, you may actually lower revenue because of the economic activity. And then if you're lowering taxes and you're on the left-hand side of the Laffer curve, then you're not going to raise more money either. So that would suggest that if we were to continue to raise tariffs and lower income and corporate taxes, that the U.S. may actually have more of a deficit each year over the horizon.
Yeah, and the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has definitely found that. Like, we are seeing lower economic growth than we would have without those tariffs, and also the tax cuts are not producing enough economic growth to compensate for the revenue loss.
Yeah, and with those tariffs, I've heard the argument like, no, look, we've collected these hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs, and I guess the maybe the less intuitive thing is, well, yeah, we might be, but then if the cost of those things coming into the U.S. has been increased by that amount, then that business, that American business that needs those supplies, may not be able to grow as fast, pay their employees as much, and then of course they pass on those costs of the increased tariffs to the consumer too. But that's a hard argument to make in 140 characters.
Yeah. Blame China is a lot simpler. But
yes, yeah. We stuck it to the Chinese. All right, so let's look at the next one.
Yeah, so this shows that the U.S. compared to some of the other countries from that first chart we saw actually reduces inequality less than they do. So even though we have the most progressive tax code, we are not very effective in the whole system reducing inequality. And the way this shows it is it basically shows what's called the Gini coefficient, Gini index. And that's a measure of broad inequality. It essentially says how much Gini index of 0 means that there is 0 inequality. So everyone has exactly the same income. And if it's 1, that means only one person has all the income in the society. So we have pretty similar inequality from just the market transactions. If based on what people are paid without taxes and transfers, our inequality is pretty similar to the UK, Germany, France. It's a little higher than Sweden, but they all do a better job of reducing that through their redistribution system.
Right. So left to its own devices, most countries have similar amount of income inequality. And these other countries on the left-hand side have developed tax and government sort of services and other policies that try and reduce that inequality. And you're saying that we as a country, we do reduce it, but we don't reduce it nearly as much as, let's say, the Germans do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And we've seen from before that we can't explain that with tax progressivity, right? It has to be explained largely from the benefit side. How much are we raising in total, and what does that mean for what we can provide to our citizens? So I think my meta point with all of this is we need to rely on transfers if we care about poverty, if we care about inequality. And specifically, I think there's good reason to believe from how other countries are performing that we can do that most effectively through generous transfers that are relatively universal. The US has very, very conditional programs, things like welfare, food stamps. You have to really be quite low income to qualify. And there's lots of reasons why you could be disqualified even if you have low income. You know, if you're not working or you're not seeking a job to the sufficient desire of the state. So UBI is kind of the end point of that, but we can make progress toward it either way.
Let me ask you the counterpoint that I would imagine some folks watching this may have, which is, well, the cost of less inequality is less economic growth, and that all of these programs are distorting kind of market incentives and resulting in less growth for the whole country. And so the fact that the US green line, that inequality factor is high, that's fine. That's life in the jungle. You know, that's why we have Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and why France doesn't.
I think it's probably true. The US does have higher GDP per capita than France, for example. And probably if we did have VAT and UBI, I would, if I had to guess, I would guess that that would reduce economic growth in the US. But I think it's worth it. You know, I think it's worth a little bit less economic growth to make sure that no one falls into poverty and really has to struggle. You know, no homelessness, no hunger. There are just so many downstream effects, especially of children being in poverty, in terms of they're less likely to contribute, have good jobs, have stable marriages, you know, not be incarcerated. All those kind of things are tied to childhood poverty. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not just correlational, that's definitely causal. So it's possible that we would make that up in, you know, decades to come. I think we couldn't rely on it, in my view, in the next 2 or 3 years after we passed a freedom dividend kind of policy, but maybe a couple decades out, we could. There's also things we can do there are things we're doing right now that neither contribute to economic growth nor are effective at reducing inequality. So for example, all these work requirements, there's not good evidence that it actually promotes people going back to work in good jobs, at least. We have lots of training programs where we spend a lot more money than it would take to just give people cash and help them get out of poverty. So all those kind of things are wasteful. And, you know, I'm not going to say France doesn't have wasteful programs too, but there are smart things we can do to mimic the good parts of European economies.
Yeah, I guess the intuition that a lot of us have is like, well, if the country's growing, then everyone, you know, the rising tide will lift all boats kind of thing. But I suppose at some point, if the Gini coefficient is over a certain level, even if the country is growing, the country's national gross domestic product is growing, there's a significant number of people who are not better off and maybe suffering. So then what's the point of all this growth if, you know, at the extreme, people are like starving in the streets kind of thing?
Yeah, there has been some analysis on how much different people throughout the income distribution have improved after taxes and transfers. I didn't include it here. I can send it later for the comments or something. But it does show that the bottom 10% still has seen improvement in their living standards in the US. But it's not as big as the top 90%, top 80%. So in economics, in kind of optimal taxation policy, you would define what's called a social welfare function, where you say, how much do I care about the essentially the living standards of each category throughout the income distribution, and you place different weights on that. And the benefit of that is you can say, well, what's the trade-off between economic growth and inequality? Because you're still going to care about top earners having higher living standards, conditional on everyone else. But the question is, are you giving up too much living standards at the bottom for that? And I would argue that we have.
Yeah, I think in politics, we tend to maybe think about things too black and white. Like it's either, oh, we are the land of the free, and the what's the term? The job creators are going to get all the benefits, or it's complete communism, and we're all like, hanging out, like wearing gray clothes issued by the government, kind of thing. So yeah, hopefully there'll be some more nuance. But let's move on to the next slide, because you've got so much good stuff here.
Yeah, so this next section kind of just talks about existing programs, and this is from a 538 analysis of some census data showing that there's what's called, I'm sure lots of people on your show are familiar with this, but we have a lot of welfare cliffs throughout our set of programs. So if you earn too much, you lose TANF, which is kind of formerly AFDC. It's basically cash welfare, although it's not much cash today. And that's going to make it so that you're actually not going to want to earn above a certain amount. Same thing happens with children's health insurance plan. So kind of we have a lot of, and actually in general, even without the cliffs, the poor face the highest marginal tax rates of anyone in the distribution because of these phase outs of benefits. I think we'd say that we have a very, and the charts we were showing earlier show we have a progressive tax code, but actually the marginal tax rates when you include taxes and transfers are so high because all of these programs phase out together throughout as you're getting out of poverty. So I think we make it really hard for people to escape poverty because of the design of the programs.
Yeah, so if you believe in hard work and also that man is motivated by incentives, what this seems to show is that as you make more money, you actually can get worse off because of these kind of the way these programs are structured. And so these things that a lot of people feel are so crucial, and they are, but the way that they're administered, they provide great disincentives to work. And I guess the optimal move is probably to be just left of that Medicaid limit for parents, because once you make a couple thousand more, then you lose all of that and you're way worse off. Is that the way to look at it?
Yeah, you sort of have to count on people either driving value from their work or hoping that they're going to earn more in the future to make it worthwhile, or not wanting to be on these programs, which like it's often not a great thing to be on Medicaid compared to other health insurance. But still, people do respond to incentives, and we shouldn't blame them for acting that way. It's quite a rational thing what you described.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if they could work, get a job, get a better job, get another job, or work more hours and result in their family being better off next month, versus like falling off this cliff and being like, what the hell did I do? I put in more hours, I worked hard for this job, and now my kids are worse off. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's see. This one, cash has less overhead than in-kind benefits.
Yeah, so in general, if you take programs like food stamps, housing vouchers, other kind of non-cash benefits, they're pretty expensive to administer. On average, they're about 10%. And these are the biggest federal programs that can benefit from most economies of scale. And compare that to something like the EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, probably one of the biggest cash transfer programs we have. That's less than 1% administrative overhead. So that's more money that we can give directly to households for every dollar we put into the program. And if you think about not just this, but all the programs at the state level, at maybe the city or the county level that are very expensive to administer because they just, they only serve maybe a few thousand people, but they have to have someone on staff working on it. Having a UBI could relieve a lot of government agencies from, demanding that overhead.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I was just looking at the CARES Act, and I think they had set aside $300 million just for the salaries of the federal workers to administer the small business loans.
Wow. And they're not even doing it. It's the banks who are doing it.
Yeah, I don't know what it was amazing. And then there's also like all the FAA money for the airlines. It was also like all this earmarked money for the Federal Aeronautical Administration, like increased staffing to deal with these stimuli programs. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that, and I would not be surprised if that administrative cost is even bigger than what these charts show, just because of just how wasteful and inefficient sometimes large organizations can be.
Exactly. And I think every time you see a high overhead cost, that's often associated not just with costs from the taxpayer side. It also means that, those people are doing investigation of people who are receiving the funds. That means the people receiving the funds are often having to engage even more with the government. So there's a ton of time costs. If you're poor, you have to dedicate, hours per week sometimes to fulfilling the requirements and just doing paperwork and understanding it. And sometimes a lot of these people might not have the education to navigate it efficiently. So we're putting people through a lot of hurdles. We're putting the government through a lot of hurdles. We're putting the taxpayers through a lot of hurdles, fundamentally because of a lack of trust, which I think is unjustified, and UBI solves that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, anytime you have to interact with a government service, it's generally not a great experience. And so I mean, even just getting your driver's license renewed is just not a great experience. I would imagine some of these guys who have to deal with, SNAP or housing vouchers, like on top of the experience not being great, there's probably a sense of like, oh, they're checking up on me. They don't trust me. I'm not a good person. They're like watching over my shoulder. Like there's cost to that too, to your point, not just dealing with the government, but also maybe the stigma of having to do all this stuff. So yeah, it's clearly the bar chart all the way to the right it's like those nonprofits that you want to donate to, that where most of the money actually goes to the people versus like, the CEO of the nonprofit and their entourage. Let's move on to the next one.
Cool. So starting to get into territory where I've done some research. So this is an analysis I did showing if we replace the child tax credit with a child allowance. So right now the child tax credit in the US is up to $2,000 per child, but it phases in with income and it phases out with income as well. So it's one of these trapezoids that US policymakers love to implement. And I showed that really would have a major progressive impact. The bottom quartile would see their income go up over 10% if we did that, just often because I think we understate how impoverished those kinds of folks are. And having any kind of phase in of the income is going to really reduce the effect for them.
Yeah, so for those who are not as familiar, what you're saying is if you replace the child tax credit with a child allowance, and child allowance is like a cash payment of some sort, or is that how that works?
Yeah, it's basically UBI for kids.
Yeah. That the people on the lowest 25%, the lowest quartile of income, that would be quartile 1, would have a 10% change in terms of the resources available to them. And then what about the cost of the government? I mean, would it be similar, or would it be more expensive to do the
Well,
child
so that would
allowance?
be more expensive because the green line is giving $2,000 to every child instead of the children who are currently eligible. But if you were cut it down to 1,500, that would be revenue neutral, and that would still be quite progressive without having a major negative effect on higher earning households. So $2,000, I think that would be maybe 20 billion or somewhere around there if we were to scale.
Not a huge amount. I mean, the gray line, if you want to be sort of more fiscally conservative, this one is like, look, government's not going to lose any money. Going to spend the same amount that we're already spending, but the bottom 25% of the country are going to be 7% better, and then the rest of the folks won't even notice. They're like barely, right?
Yep. And once it's universal, it's a lot easier to make it monthly. So other countries have monthly child allowances. Ireland and Sweden both have that, and they're truly universal. So I think that one of the challenges with having a means-tested monthly program is you have to figure out, am I going to claw it back later, or am I going to make it based on income from a year ago, even though you're continuing to give payments almost 2 years later? So universality solves that.
Now, one of the things that some of my more conservative family and friends would say is like, look, any kind of incentive for people to have more children is suspect. That, you remember, well, you probably won't, but back in the 80s, there was a Reagan kind of campaign around these welfare queens, and they would have all these babies just to get drive around in Cadillacs and, wear Rolexes and stuff. And I'm just curious, have you seen any research around child benefits and the impact on number of kids per family and the poverty level of that family?
Yeah, there is a small effect. I think if I remember right, it doesn't actually make people have their first child, but it could induce people to have their second or third child maybe earlier than they would have otherwise. But right now, we are actually in a situation where we risk becoming closer to Japan in terms of population. So if anything, this is the time, in my opinion, and I think a lot of population researchers, where we should expand this kind of child assistance, if for no other reason than to encourage more childbearing. Yeah.
So you raised the point about Japan having so few young people and all these old people, so it's kind of like this inverted pyramid looking thing. What's your view on whether or not we need more and more workers? I mean, obviously with Andrew's campaign, he was advocating that artificial intelligence and automation would replace a lot of today's jobs. Is your view that, well, that's fine, but 5 or 10 years from now, there'll be newer jobs, so the total employment kind of need for labor won't go down? Do you have a take on that?
I think so. I think it's possible that automation will, reduce the number of jobs we have in the future. But right now, I'm not sure the evidence has borne that out too much, and this is an area I might disagree with some Yang Gang folks on. But if you consider what Japan has had as an issue, it's kind of what we're dealing with right now, where people need a lot of healthcare. And if you're an old folk in a hospital in Japan, you're basically relying on your family members to provide you help in that room, cooking meals, things like that, because they just don't have enough young people to work in the hospitals. And we're dealing that with pandemics. I think health is going to be a bigger part of the economy in the future. This is just going to jumpstart that. And the worst thing that happens is we have more kids. That's more humans who get to enjoy life on this planet. And we still have all the robots to take care of them, and they won't actually have to do any work in the future. I think I would be okay with that too.
Someone was asking in the chat a few minutes ago about, here we go, whether all of this like pro-human policy will result in overpopulation and pollution. Curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's possible, although so far we've seen in the US, for example, that we are actually producing less carbon emissions per capita. As more countries have the same kind of economic growth that we've had, that's going to continue to be the case. And actually, in the US, we're actually now using less material overall to produce all the goods that we rely on. So there's this concept, I think from MIT Economist as well, called dematerialization. And that's going to continue as well. At the same time, if you look at who's developing the clean technology that we need to reduce pollution, even do carbon capture, things like that, those are young, educated, bright people who are developing that kind of technology. We're going to need more of those in the future as well.
All right, let's move on to the next one. This is about, hold on. Where were we? Here we go. This minor change would end extreme child poverty. All right, extreme child poverty. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is the leftmost series of bars. This is basically representing the share of the population child population in poverty after taxes and transfers according to different thresholds. So if you take the extreme child poverty rate, that's basically $2 a day. Probably we don't have much of that. This might even exaggerate it based on survey issues. But supposing we have any of it, having a child allowance like what I mentioned on the previous slide would completely end extreme child poverty. So I think that, and we see also kind of a deterioration in the share of people or children in poverty, depending on the line, we're really reducing this situation, which is correlated with lower productivity as an adult, all these kind of issues later in life.
So is the crux of the child tax credit that if you're too poor to have any taxes to pay, then this tax credit, like, it doesn't do you any good? Is that the reason why the CTC is so much worse than the child benefit?
It's a good question. Yeah, so it's actually a mix of two programs, the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit. And the additional child tax credit is refundable. So even if you don't owe any taxes, you still get a benefit from it. But the child tax credit is not. And these are always bunched together, essentially. So if you don't pay any federal tax, there's kind of an upper bound lower than $2,000 that you get from it.
Got it. Makes perfect sense. Let's go to this one. Ooh, the freedom dividend. I've heard of this.
Yeah.
Let's see here. The freedom dividends taxes are progressive. Whoops. Let's go back here. So tell me about this one.
Yeah. So a common objection from people around the freedom dividend, as we talked about earlier, is that the taxes are regressive. And that is slightly true for the VAT. But if you look at Andrew's full proposal, the VAT is just one piece. It's about 2/3 of the revenue comes from the VAT. He also calls for a carbon tax, treating capital gains as ordinary income. And there's a couple other features that tend to be progressive. So if you put all of that together, we're looking at the tax rate as a share of income by income decile. It's roughly flat for the bottom 9 deciles, and then it goes up quite a bit for the topmost decile. So it is technically progressive. I think this is not the right way to evaluate a reform. You need to look at it in the whole. But if people are concerned about it, at least this diffuses one of the common objections.
Yeah. So as you get the richest 10% will pay more taxes than everyone else under the Yang plan.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So then some people will hopefully be a little bit more at ease. Maybe I think they would probably argue like, well, it's not progressive enough. It should be like 5 times as much as the bottom decile or something. But that's at least it's not regressive.
Right.
So let's this one. But the full policy is much more progressive. Oh, talk about this one.
Yeah. So this is showing that, in my opinion, and from the research I've done, this would probably be the most progressive, most poverty reducing policy, maybe in US history. Maybe Social Security is close. But Social Security is kind of a regressive payment system as well. So the fact that this is a truly universal program paid to everyone makes it such that the net benefit after taxes and transfers for the bottom decile, the bottom 10%, is over 100%. We're over doubling their income.
Wow.
And this just continues to drop off until you reach the top decile, and they're losing more than they're getting from it. But as a share of income, it's like 3% of their income.
That's amazing. So if you're in the bottom 10% of America's wealth earners, you would have more than double the disposable income to you with the freedom dividend and Yang's plan. And if you care about truly poor people, then this should be like a mic drop moment, right? Like, but interestingly enough, I don't want to steer too much into politics, but I do have to say, like, it is weird that even within the Democratic Party, there isn't like a warm embrace of basic income. I think it's getting better, but I'm curious, like within the academic world and the world of economists that are running the numbers, I'm sure you probably encounter skepticism around basic income at MIT as well, or is it more like, oh, everybody already gets it? It's just those rascals down in DC.
I think people understand who've worked with the data how impactful UBI would be. Where some of the skepticism comes in more is around the revenue. It's just very hard to convince people to add new taxes. The top decile here, it might only be 3%, but try selling a 3% tax increase to the upper 10%. That's only people with maybe 300,000 income or more. This isn't multimillionaires necessarily, but you have to. If we're gonna have the kind of programs we need, this could be Medicare for all too. We just have to raise those kind of revenues, but people who've seen the challenges of adding those new taxes are concerned that it might not be possible.
Yeah, good point. All right, let's move on to this guy, which is, whoops, hold on. Hold on. 90% of less than 200K earners benefit. Okay, so this is not just the impoverished. This is people who earn less than 200,000. Yeah, tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so this is kind of charts, advanced charting here. So basically what we're looking at is we're breaking down every income segment. So for example, we can look at the top income segment. So that's going to be $1 million or more. And the color corresponds to how the freedom dividend would affect different people within that income segment. So the light yellow corresponds to a decrease in disposable income that's smaller than 5%. And the more brown is over 5%. So if you're making $1 million or more, most people in that category are having a pretty significant reduction in disposable income. Probably 95% or so are having 5% or more. reduction.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what the average reduction is for the 5% or more? Is it like 20% reduction, or how big of a hit is it for those millionaires?
I don't know for that group, but overall we saw that the top decile falls 3%. So it might be 10% or so, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So this is
Um,
interesting because a lot of the criticisms around the freedom dividend was like, how dare you give Bill Gates $1,000 a month? But I think this chart shows that, hey, look, Bill Gates is probably going to have less disposable income
Oh yeah, definitely.
because of the VAT than him getting $1,000 a month.
The VAT and the capital gains
So
reform. Yeah.
now there are groups in the lower brackets that are still yellow and brown in terms of having a reduction in income. Can you talk about why, even the less than 10K isn't all, blue?
Yeah, that's almost entirely because they're not citizens. So the freedom dividend is limited to citizens. So they're all facing at least some tax increase. Everyone is, because of higher, the VAT. But any household that doesn't get the VAT or the UBI is going to be worse off. So that's about 8%, 7% of Americans, concentrated on the bottom earners.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. So this is not a chart showing the impact on all citizens. It's actually all people in America, including non-citizens who would not be eligible, and that's why they're going to have to pay the VAT, but they're not going to get the freedom dividend.
Right.
Got you.
And the important part of this is the reason it isn't, which is the reason I think most critics on the left assume it is, which is people losing their benefits, because the freedom dividend requires you to, give up food stamps, SSI,
Right.
a couple other benefits. That only affects, I think, less than maybe 2 million people come out behind because they have to give up benefits. Our benefits just aren't that generous. So I think another kind of talking point that just doesn't match the data.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, like, if for some reason you're getting so much value from government program A that's cash-like, then you don't have to take the dividend of equal value. You can say, no, I'm going to keep that program and just get a smaller dividend. Like, that's a choice that people would have been able to make.
That's right. Yeah, and this model accounts for that. So
yeah.
The problem is if you're in that situation, it's still possible that, well, actually anyone in that situation is going to come out behind because they're going to still pay more taxes through the VAT, and they're not getting.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
Benefit.
Good point. Oh, Trumper Yang has a good finger on the pulse of Republicans, and he's saying, hey, if you can provide the numbers on the top row, I think the skepticism will be like, well, maybe these millionaires are going to lose disposable income by 50%, and that's the trick of this whole thing. I know you pointed out that the top 10% are only going to have a 3% reduction, but any more clarity on that, if we could double click on that $1 million or more row, would be interesting. If the
sure. Yeah, thanks for
yeah. All right, let's move on to this guy. The freedom dividend doesn't fully pay for itself. Okay, so let's talk about that. What does this tell us?
Yeah, so this is where I might lose some friends I've made in the past couple slides, but in general, if you look at my analysis was kind of a static analysis. It's unclear whether adding behavioral features would increase or decrease the deficit cost. But roughly, I find that after you take into account the taxes, the benefit savings, and people who decline the UBI, the freedom dividend pays for about half of itself. So it would cost about 2.8 trillion. That's the net or the total price tag. And then the net price tag would be about 1.4 trillion.
Right. And so do you not buy the argument on more? I mean, I remember one of Andrew's talking points around how to pay for it was yes, we have the VAT. We have these other types of taxes like the carbon tax and sort of like hedge fund tax and this kind of other stuff. But I think there was another argument about more economic growth, because we're putting the money into the hands of people who generally don't have a lot of disposable income or as much, and they're more likely to spend it back into the local economy, which will then generate more VAT. Do you find that? What's your take on that argument? Do you think there's anything there, or do you think that's kind of wishful thinking?
I think it's true to some degree, but you're also removing some people's dollars from the economy too, right? Anyone who is maybe a high earner, or for some other reason they're paying higher taxes under the program, that's less money that they can circulate through the economy. So I think you when you think about that kind of argument, you have to think about all sides of it. And there are other reasons why people might reduce the amount of time that they work, and maybe that's okay. But the way we currently measure GDP, if we have a higher tax and that discourages people from working, that will reduce GDP as well, and that ultimately makes it harder to recoup the cost through taxation. So it's possible. I think there's some uncertainty, but it needs maybe more analysis.
Yeah. What about avoidance of new costs? So let's say, I think the argument is, hey, if everybody had a freedom dividend, there might be less crime, there may be less depression, there may be less people being sick at work, or they might be more productive, etc. Is that factored into this analysis, or do you say, well, look, maybe that'll happen, maybe not, I'm not going to count on it for the model?
I did not include that in here. I think that's all true. I don't think it's enough. I've looked at some of the evidence on it without incorporating it to the model, but I just don't think it's a big enough effect to offset this 1.4 trillion. I think where you could see some benefits is maybe 10, 20 years down the line, you're really reducing that childhood poverty, and that's going to improve the productivity of those kids when they enter the labor force. That could be a significant effect. But if you think of the biggest costs to the healthcare system, for example, it's more about things like cancer, which really I don't see a clear pathway from this to reducing, the way that we spend a lot of money to treat cancer. There have been for example, some of your listeners may be familiar with the research out of Canada from the Mincome experiment in Manitoba. And that found that there were reduced hospitalizations and accidents. So I think that could be a really great knock-on effect, but those aren't very expensive procedures to treat for when people experience them.
Right on. And what about if you just lowered the amount of the freedom dividend? It sounds like if you lowered it from $1,000 a month to, I know I'm not going to make a lot of friends here, but to $500 a month, then you get to a point where it is starting to look more revenue neutral. Is that fair? Or
you just go 2 slides down and you'll see.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. Let's go to this next slide here, which is other modelers agree. Yes. So what you took a look at how other people were analyzing and assessing this.
Yeah. So this is an analysis from the Tax Foundation, which is a think tank in DC, and they did an analysis of freedom dividend as well, and they found pretty similar to what I found, that it would be still roughly $1.5 trillion net deficit effect.
Okay, so that doesn't sound great, but then we're going to go to the next slide, which says a $500 a month freedom dividend would still be progressive.
Yeah, so if you have in your mind kind of the chart we saw a few slides ago, which found that the bottom decile with $1,000 a month would roughly double their disposable income, that falls to about 50%. That goes up, but it's still progressive. On average, the bottom 8 deciles all benefit, and now the top 2 deciles come out behind. And this would pay for itself fully.
Yeah, so let's just make sure that that lands with everyone. If we had a $500 a month freedom dividend, the poorest 10% of the country would have a 50% or over 40% growth in their disposable income, which is a very big deal, right? If you're in that bottom. In fact, all groups except for the top 20% would be better off. And frankly, that ninth decile group looks like they're almost in a wash.
Yeah.
And then the top decile, the top 10% would have, looks like 8 or 7% lower disposable income.
Yeah.
Something around there.
Yep.
Yeah, something like that. So
Yeah.
This seems like everyone could start to converge, because now you're not worried about introducing massive government debt. Although nowadays seems like nobody really cares about that. But let's just say we're want to be fiscally responsible. You can have a freedom dividend, and you can basically pay for it and benefit, basically the 80% of the country. Another 10% won't notice, and then the top 10% will have $8 less out of every $100 that they spend on their new Ferraris and stuff.
Yep.
All right. Let's go to the next slide. Example: low income single parent benefits. Okay, let me zoom out here a little bit so we can see more of it. What's this telling us?
Yeah, so this is if you go to plans.ubicenter.org, you can play around with this tool yourself. This is a calculator where you can specify the number of people you have in your household, number of children, adults, your income, and whether you have benefits. So I just selected a arbitrary 1 adult, 1 child, relatively low income person. And across all those people in the current population survey, you can see that the UBI would first of all be 471. So it's not quite 500. 471 is what's needed to be budget neutral. And then they're paying 250 more in taxes, and on average they're losing $90 in benefits. But after all of that together, the net change is still 130 a month, which would make quite a big difference for a household of this kind of income.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you get a check. You're going to pay a little more in VAT, because I think a lot of people are saying, "Oh man, if I have to pay a VAT, now what's the point? I don't want your check." But you're saying, "Oh, the check's going to be bigger than the VAT you're going to pay." And then even if you have to give up your cash-like benefits, you'll lose $340, but you just got a $471 check, so you're good. You're better off.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next one, which is can explore. Whoops. Oops. Is this another? Okay, so this is like kind of a summary across a variety of scenarios. Like now you've got the 2 children, 2 adults, 2 children, 50. So this is a middle income person, and they're still making a positive net change.
Yeah.
Especially because it's 2 adults.
Right. And I think one of the cool things you can do here, if you are interested, you can select different plans. So I have the budget neutral freedom dividend. That's the 471 per person. There's also the original freedom dividend. So if you want to see how that kind of household would be affected by the 1,000 a month, even taking into account the fact that it would increase the deficit, there's a drop down there too. So.
Oh, hey, Max, Vaughn was asking, hey, he's in and out of this live stream. In the future, is this deck available at ubicenter.org, or is it coming out soon?
Let me make a bit.ly link real quick for it, and then I'll post it on Twitter and stuff like that as well.
Great. So don't forget to follow at Max Ghenis, and he'll give you all that shit. Sorry, all that stuff, and more. All right, let's move on to the next one. What if we went all out on UBI? Ooh, whoa, what's this talking about? What's this?
Can I enter stuff into the chat?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go for it.
Let's see. I was only to...
While you're entering that, and don't put it in the private chat because that's just to me. Oh,
Yeah,
that Bitly? Oh,
I don't see a way to enter it to the live comments.
I'll do it. I'll put it in live comments right now.
Cool, thanks.
Posted. All right, everybody. In the live chat, you'll see a Bitly link. That's to a public version of the deck. What's this slide saying? What do you mean all out? You mean like going hardcore, huh?
Yeah, so I think freedom dividend is one way, a VAT,
Yeah.
but we could do something even more generous if we think about way more ways to raise revenue. So this is for a talk I gave at a UBI conference last year, thinking about what if we replace all tax deductions, all tax credits, replace the payroll tax, the minimum tax, alternative minimum tax, and every cash benefit, essentially, cash and cash-like benefit. Leave Medicare and Medicaid together. And we're going to put, instead, a 50% flat tax on all income. So no VAT in this scenario, although you could do a similar analysis with it.
How much of a basic income would that give? Is that the $500 a month level or something else?
Nope. Next slide shows.
Oh.
So it would be roughly $16,000 per person, and that would also include kids.
Oh, this is even more than the freedom dividend.
Yeah, this would be kind of a out there revolutionary approach. It would end poverty essentially in this country. It would reduce inequality dramatically, but a lot of people would come out behind. So roughly a third of all individuals would have less disposable income as a result, and most of those would lose more than 5% of their disposable income.
A question from Landline. Is there a base level of income that is not taxed before the 50%, or is the flat tax applied from the first dollar?
First dollar, yeah.
So this is definitely a more aggressive one. I prefer your $500 a month revenue neutral one. But I like that you're kind of flaring to see okay, well, if we went to extremes, what would it look like? Are you an advocate of this approach, of the all out one?
Well, yeah, I think so, actually. I did it mostly to explore a different type of modeling, which I can talk about in the next couple slides, where you use machine learning, essentially, to figure out how do you optimize the features of a UBI policy. So this was kind of the starting baseline for dedicating a large revenue stream to a UBI, which then you would allocate to different groups of people using machine learning. But I actually do think something aggressive like this could be a good long-term goal.
Wait a minute. Allocate to people using machine learning. So it's not a flat dividend. It's a flat tax, but then the basic income payment to each person would vary. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, exactly. So one scenario is you take all this revenue, there's like $5 trillion roughly, and you just give it to everyone as $16,000 UBI. But often when we're talking about UBI policy, we're talking about maybe a different amount for kids, maybe a different amount for seniors, potentially. I mean, that hasn't been as much part of the policy discussion yet, but I think it's worth exploring. So this uses machine learning to figure out how you set those amounts to reach different objectives.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next slide. So now you're now you're taking a very cool idea, basic income, and you're using a very hot topic, which is machine learning. Tell us some more. I'm kind of scared and excited at the same time.
Cool. So yeah, I use approach that it's not like deep learning exactly, but it's an approach that's commonly used in deep learning and machine learning tools called, I think, a gradient descent, where basically you're exploring a range of alternatives and going deep into the ones that have the most promise. So essentially you're doing many, I did thousands, I think, of different UBI policies. and let the machine essentially adjust what those parameters are and see how it affects optimization function. So in this example, I think we're looking at how the share of people who come out behind changes as there are more runs of the UBI model. And you can see as it tries different things out, it's identifying increasingly efficient versions of the policy.
What sort of different policy levers is it exploring to change?
It's pretty simple. It's just those three. It's really just two features. But basically how much you give to kids, how much you give to adults, and how much you give to seniors. So those, but you could imagine.
All right. So is there going to be a slide where you, and will you show what that optimal sort of prediction is? Is that coming up in a subsequent slide?
That's coming up right now. Yeah, and then there's more.
All right. The payoff. What's this one telling us?
So, for example, I rounded before. If you just look at that first row, that was showing that if you take all that money, you give it to everyone, that's giving a 15.7K UBI to everyone. That reduces poverty quite a bit, inequality quite a bit, and other features a fair amount. But suppose you want to instead optimize the policy to minimize the share who come out behind. So that loser share, second from the right column. That's going to produce a different UBI policy. It's going to give a lot more to adults, a lot less to kids, and very little to seniors. I think this is because seniors already have Social Security. So yeah, they're not having income that would be taxed in the same way. And you can reduce the share of losers essentially by 3.5 percentage points to 31% by doing that.
Wow.
Or you could consider a different policy where instead of minimizing the losers, you're minimizing the inequality that comes from that. And that actually gives totally different parameters. You're giving a ton to seniors and then not much to children either. But that reduces inequality about also 3 percentage points more than the flat version does.
So that's surprising to me, that bottom row with the income inequality reduction approach where you reduce it by 22%. Is that suggesting that the seniors are one of the biggest victims of income inequality, and that's why the model is predicting that we should pay out the senior UBI so much more? Is it because they are a disproportionate percentage of the impoverished?
I think so. Senior poverty is pretty low as like below the poverty rate, but there are a lot of them who are just kind of above it because they're getting a lot of income from Social Security and maybe capital gains or something like that, but they won't have the labor income that people in the labor force do. So it's that piece, and also it's that seniors have smaller households. So this is actually inequality at the household level rather than the per person level. So I think it's a combination of those two things that says we should give a lot to seniors because it's going to equalize a lot of households per dollar. So I think it's kind of illustrative for me in terms of people who are designing policy or thinking about how we should feature different parts of policy design. What is your objective and how we work backward from there, and really what your objective is and kind of the nuance of those objectives matters quite a bit in doing those designs. Totally.
Yeah, super cool. This is like more advanced analysis than I've seen talking about basic income. So kudos to you. Now, it looks like you also have a section about the impact of COVID and UBI.
Yeah, so this is the last section. I know I've taken a lot of your time, so thank you for going through.
No, this is great. Thank you for sharing your time.
Yeah. So when I've been thinking about the effect of COVID-19 and the policies that have been introduced, there have been a couple things that have worried me, frankly. One is that we are giving a lot to adults, not much to children. I think there's a problem with the freedom dividend as well, frankly, because per dollar, you can just reduce poverty more by including children. And two is that we're giving money based on a very outdated signal of what people's current needs are. And that's often past income, maybe income from 2 years ago in the US, up to 3 years ago almost. So in this first analysis, what I wanted to show is how much, if we expect COVID-19 to reduce incomes by some amount, let's say 10%, although I explored different amounts in the paper, how much do we need to give to stabilize the poverty rate? Essentially ensure that whatever that 12.8% we saw before in the SPM poverty rate slide, that doesn't increase beyond what it was last year. And what you see is that you can have two lines. And if we do nothing, we're probably going to have a 16% poverty rate. That's the upper left corner of this chart. And then as we get more and more UBI amounts, these are just one-time payments to people, we're going to reduce the poverty rate. And that steepness of the curve is much stronger in magnitude when we include everyone. We include adults and children, compared to the orange line, which is just for citizens and just for adults.
Yeah, that's super cool. So I guess the TLDR is like, we should expect the poverty rate to increase because of COVID and the recession that we're in. And that if you only give the dividend to adults, you can decrease poverty. And this is the annual amount. So when we're talking about the freedom dividend, or even your $500 a month plan, it would reduce it significantly more, because it would max out on the bottom axis by to 5,000 or 6,000 or something. But you're saying, hey, if you really want to end poverty or reduce poverty, you have to factor in those families with kids, because the two adults with no kids and just like the Labradoodle get the same freedom dividend as the two adults with like 3 kids.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the poverty rate considers the number of kids you have. So I think this chart probably isn't surprising to people because, of course, you have to give larger UBIs if you're trying to achieve the same result by giving it to fewer people. The question which I address in the next slide is, does it compensate? So is it more efficient when you add up all of that money? What costs more money to the total government? And there I find also we can save money by including everyone. So if your goal is to stabilize poverty, you can do that with a true UBI of roughly 260 billion. But if you only limit it to adult citizens, it's more like 350 billion. It's much more expensive.
And why would it be more expensive if you have a UBI limited to just adults versus everyone? I'm not rocking that one.
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with the previous chart, kind of, because you have to give a larger UBI to each of the adult citizen groups in order to stabilize poverty.
Got it. So you can either give a big UBI to all the adults or a smaller UBI to everyone. And it actually, if you just care about reducing poverty, you can reduce it more with a smaller payment to everyone than a big payment to the adults.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I know we're running short on time, Max. I don't want to overstay our welcome with you. Are there other slides that I should hit before we wrap up? Because I know
we're almost done. I think we're like 5 minutes away. If that.
Oh, you want to power through? Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Cool. So this is my latest paper, actually, extending some work from an MIT economist named Ben Olken and his co-author from, I think, Harvard, Rima Hana. And they did some work with the Indonesian and Peruvian governments to say, we're going to help you figure out how you should target a means-tested program. Should you give a lot to very few people, or should we give a smaller amount to everyone? And how does that affect some notion of social welfare? And the trick they put in also was, we are going to use the survey that you use for distributing the cash transfers, which is in general pretty noisy, and we're going to compare it to a much more detailed survey to really understand people's needs at that time, essentially their current consumption. And they found that for a couple of reasons, partially including the fact that you're getting a noisy signal, you're better off giving something like 20-30% of people the transfer compared to just 10% or something. Because basically, if you think someone's in need, they probably are in need. But if you think someone's not in need, but they're close to the threshold, the noisier their signal, the more likely it is that actually in reality, they do need the help. So I essentially mimic that kind of analysis. With
Max, remind me what the y-axis is.
The y-axis is essentially social welfare, some notion of social welfare. It's it's called the constant risk, relative risk aversion metric, which is one of the metrics for social welfare. So kind of like how well is overall society doing? And the x-axis here is what share of the people you actually target. So I kind of come to a similar conclusion. If you just care about, for a relatively small transfer, optimizing social welfare, you should give it to maybe 15% of the population. That's going to optimize social welfare. But there's more to the analysis that kind of confirms more UBI priors.
Right. So this would contradict the theme of what we were talking about earlier, which is, hey, the previous slide was like, hey, the more people that can get it, the more you can reduce poverty. But this is saying, well, if you want to optimize for social welfare, which I guess is not the same as poverty, then you could just give it to 20% of the people.
Well, so I think the big difference is here we're not adjusting how much revenue we can use. I think if you could pair this also with, we're going to do a VAT and the rate of the VAT is going to expand such that we're going to give more to more people at higher rates, then we'd still find before, like more universal transfers are better. But this is just, you have a fixed budget, maybe 1% of GDP. You want to share that fixed budget with a group of people. You're better off giving it not to everyone in some cases.
Yeah. Interesting. And I guess if you're a conservative, then the 20% might be a surprising number because it's probably bigger than some people might imagine. Some people might think like, oh, well, transfers should just be for the poorest 1% or the poorest 5%. What you're saying here is that, well, actually 1 out of 5 could benefit from a transfer if you just optimize for social welfare.
That's right. And I think this is for a transfer that's 0.2% of GDP. So the bigger the transfer budget, the farther out that peak is going to go. But yeah, right now, I think it's like 10% of the population gets food stamps, something like that. So yeah, that's kind of closer to what you were describing.
All right, let's go to the next one.
So this shows, now on the x-axis, we're showing the budget of the program. So we were looking just at one particular budget before. Now we're looking at a range of budgets. And we're showing on the y-axis is if you take lots of different policies where we're targeting different sets of people, what share of the population should we target? And if we look just at the blue line, that's sort of for a very noisy signal, we're seeing that this goes up over time. So the bigger the budget, the more people you should include in the program, which kind of makes sense. Compared to the green line, where we have a perfect signal of someone's income today, then you're still going to give more to more people as the budget increases, but less compared to the noisy signal.
And why does the program budget as a share of GDP max out at what is the horizontal axis seems to, why wouldn't it go up to like 10% or does it go to 10%? Maybe
it's 10%.
Okay.
Or maybe 5% is the rightmost line. Yeah, I think it's 5%.
So at 5%, you still would want to give the benefit. Well, you still only want to give the benefit to 40% of people, which is still lower than I would have expected. I would have thought at some point you'd want to give it to almost everybody.
Yeah, and you actually do end up giving it to basically everybody in the blue line. But when you have 40%, and this all sort of depends on your weighting system. So does your social welfare function really emphasize the well-being of the poor compared to well-being of middle class or richer people? All these are kind of policy decisions. But I think the key takeaway I wanted to communicate with this one is that the noisier the signal, the more people you want to include. And actually a UBI, when you have a really noisy signal, which I think we do today, we don't know how people are, what their fiscal situation is in regards to COVID-19. But we're targeting things based on 2 or 3 years ago where their situation may have been very different. So I think we should consider that in thinking about emphasizing more universal transfers, because we just don't know who's going to need it, who isn't.
And so, yeah, that's a great point. Landline was asking, so what is the noise? I think you're saying the noise is our understanding of each person's financial situation, or how would you describe the noise?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm taking everyone's true income and I'm just manually adding noise to it. That's sort of what I'm doing from an analytical perspective. So I'm saying, maybe you said it was 50. I'm going to add somewhere between -20 and +20 to that. And the more of that noise you add, the more effect is.
Yeah. So, and your point is, like, in a COVID world, the noise level is super high because nobody knows what the impact to everybody's income is, which then would argue, ironically, that these coronavirus stimulus plans coming out of DC, which are costing multi-trillion dollars, should have the least targeting possible and just be as direct and universal as possible. But that's not what we see. What we see is line by line, this program for dairy farmers, this program for corn farmers, this program for kale farmers, everybody gets a little $100 million program. But I think you're suggesting here that it might be more efficient if you want to have optimal use of the resources to just make it as universal as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Even the recovery rebates, which the IRS administered and have actually gone quite well. They've given tens, hundreds of millions of checks already in the first few weeks. Those are still mean tested to about roughly the bottom 90%. And there could be people who were earning, $80,000 a year 2 years ago, and maybe now they're struggling to earn 30 or 40 because they worked at a restaurant or something. But the recovery rebates give a lot less to an individual earning 80 compared to someone earning 40.
Right on. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so this is kind of the conclusion of the analysis, which also says, rather than just picking one threshold, which could be universal or it could be everyone below the 50th percentile or something like that, what if you're able to allocate a share of that total transfer budget to UBI? So basically you could have a means tested component and a UBI component. How much does that ability to segment the transfer into those two categories improve social welfare? And here we also see that if you have a very noisy signal and a budget that isn't very big, so I think this kind of corresponds to like the recovery rebates, you'd be better off splitting that up into a means tested and universal component. You're going to improve the effect on welfare by up to 70% if you do that.
Now, the bottom line is the percentage of GDP of our stimulus plans already is way more than 1%.
Yes, the total for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about the recovery rebates. But yeah, if you consider the PPP loans and things like that, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. I have a couple of questions after we get to this last slide.
Cool.
But let's wrap up this slide and then we'll have a little quick Q&A because I'm dying to ask you something.
Great. So this very last analysis, I was comparing one of the big pieces of the total stimulus is this $600 per week extra unemployment benefit for people who are on it. So I looked at a year ago, or I guess 2018, so 2 years ago, how would that budget have looked if we instead redirected it to a UBI? How does that affect poverty? And it turns out that if we made it a UBI instead, that would have had 2 to 3x the poverty effect of just giving every unemployment beneficiary $600 a week. So you could argue that maybe we're in a different situation now. It's different kind of people who are benefiting from unemployment today compared to 2018. I think it's pretty unlikely that, given how significant this effect is, it would overcome it. But I'm planning to do some more research on that. So.
Whoa, hold on a second. Let me make sure I understand this one, because this seems pretty profound. So you're saying if you took the same amount of money that you are spending on unemployment benefits and you used it as a UBI for everybody instead, you would actually have a bigger impact on reducing poverty. So it looks like twice the impact, more than twice the impact.
That's right.
And you wouldn't spend more, you wouldn't incur more debt to the government. It would just be the same amount that we're spending.
Yeah, it's
that's cool. Is that because there's people who are employed but impoverished? Is that the reason?
It's both that and people who are out of the labor force, so they're not eligible for unemployment.
Yeah.
We're also benefiting. But it's definitely counterintuitive. People don't expect that unemployment is regressive, but actually OECD finds that this is true in the US too, because largely, and this isn't part of this analysis, but unemployment tracks wages, and wages are regressive, right? I mean, the more you earn, the more unemployment you get. It caps out at a certain amount, but still that cap is pretty generous. So we have a lot of programs in this country that try to prioritize stability over poverty reduction and reduction, and often that just goes unsaid. So.
I never thought about that unemployment benefits are regressive. So if I make whatever 50K a year and I go on unemployment, and my neighbor, he was making 25K a year and he goes on unemployment, he doesn't get, I get a much bigger check than him, even though we're both kind of SOL.
Right.
Yeah. And so the UBI would say like, well, maybe Tom at 50K, like he doesn't need as much of a unemployment benefit, or his UBI will be a little smaller, but it'll benefit all these other people who are only making like 15, 20K and are now unemployed. And then of course the people who are still employed but not making a lot of money, and to your other point, people just not in the labor market.
Yes, disabilities or something like that. Yeah.
So dude, we need to talk about, were you part of the Yang Brain Trust? Like, it seems like you've been doing a ton of work here. Please tell me that you're involved. And if not, we need to change that. Or maybe you want to stay apolitical. Is that part of the challenge?
No, I mean, I think what Yang did is a tremendous benefit. I didn't agree with him on everything, but between the UBI and the VAT, to be honest, I wasn't as into the VAT before he really went all out on it. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important piece that we're missing. I was actually just talking last night with some folks. I'm in California. Mm-hmm. And there's an assembly member here who proposed a UBI policy, Assembly Member Lowe. And so there's a group of some former Yang Gang folks who are trying to think about how we make sure that could succeed and do other analyses and outreach and all that kind of stuff. I know some of the folks at Humanity Forward as well. Mm-hmm. So, but at the same time, I want this to be a think tank that the UBI Center should be kind of nonpartisan. I think that kind of aligns with other policies. I think just doing the right kinds of analyses is going to show that there's a lot of political benefit for some of these policies. So I hope to contribute in that way.
Now, there are people running for Congress and Senate that are pro-UBI, and I'm guessing in their campaigns, they're going to get their opponents like saying, "Oh, this is regressive," or "This is going to soak the rich," blah blah blah. And would the UBI Center be willing to provide sort of this type of information, these types of charts, so that candidates can use it, or do you want to stay really kind of like 2 arms lengths away from anyone running for office or in politics?
Oh, I'd be thrilled if a member of Congress wanted to cite some of my research in terms of if they want custom research for their own policy design. That takes resources like any other nonprofit project. So hoping to increase the resources of the UBI Center over time so I can have more and help other people help out with making all of those kinds of analyses. But I think that's exactly the kind of work that think tanks do in general. Like if something is big in the news, if there's someone who's proposing an ambitious policy, help get the information to the campaign, information to the media, information to policymakers of all stripes and the public to make informed decisions.
And so tell us a little bit more about the UBI Center, like your plans for it going forward. Is it, it sounds like you're the primary worker right now, or is there a team that's already there, or are you thinking of building out a team? And then, how are you looking for resources to kind of fund all this stuff?
Yeah, right now it is pretty much me. I'm working with a couple of students on some new projects that haven't been published yet, but I'm excited for the work that they've done. And yeah, I'm hoping to build out more of a team in the future. I think people who would be especially suited to this kind of work would be relatively more technical kind of people who have economics interest or expertise. But I think over time, there's a range of like nonprofit funders who I think might be interested and want to pursue those kind of angles. But anyone can make a donation if they want to. On the website, I'm also working with the Policy Simulation Library they basically have a fiscal sponsor. So if you want to make a tax deductible donation, there's ways to do that too. And yeah, if anyone just wants to volunteer and has that kind of expertise and wants to, just contribute to 1 or 2 projects or a piece of a project, everything's on GitHub. So reach out to me directly, max@ubicenter.org, or check out the GitHub page for ways to help.
Love it. And you are a nonprofit, so people can make tax deductible donations, or?
I'm not tax deductible yet, but I have I'm working with a group that has a fiscal sponsor. So if you go to the website, there's a way to make a tax deductible donation.
Great. Well, I hope people consider donating, because I think the work you're doing is highly leveraged in that obviously a lot of us donate to candidates running for office, and I think we should continue to do that. Yeah. But the stuff that the UBI Center is doing, like just the charts that we looked at for the last hour and a half, I mean, these are really compelling and interesting and thought-provoking analyses that take a lot of the emotion and the rhetoric and the kind of tribalism out of it. And so you could argue like, well, this kind of work that's done by, really capable and credible experts in analysis has cascading effects on how we think about policy much more broadly than one campaign would even. So hopefully people will check out ubicenter.org. And Max, I really appreciate you spending so much time, and I have a feeling that people will be sharing out this video with their fellow nerds and UBI advocates. But before we wrap up, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to let the audience know about?
I guess just following up on your last point, I think there's also opportunity for more international analysis of UBI. There's a lot of, I think, great opportunity in the US, and Andrew Yang has made a positive impact here. I think he's also made a positive impact in other developed countries. And in developing countries, there kind of was pre-existing demand for these kind of policies. India has done a lot of research from top ministers even. I think they are interested in seeing more of the data, seeing some of the analysis like this and other analysis that other researchers have done. So I want to just invite other people, not just Americans, but outside too. I love hearing about other people's perspective outside the US with regard to UBI, and of course, Americans too. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, and I hope to maybe be back sometime in the future.
Absolutely. No, for sure.
And everything. So
I will never turn down cool charts.
Yes.
And you seem like a man that knows his way around a chart. I would also I'm very hopeful that that Andrew, have you connected with Andrew? Have you and he ever talked?
Haven't talked. Yeah, I shared the analysis with his team, and yeah, that was kind of the extent of it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Well, I hope for Humanity Forward's kind of efforts around understanding the impact of UBI, and they probably are doing major fundraising, and they probably could use some more folks. So I'm hope that it doesn't sound like you're averse to having conversations with, let's call them politicians. You're just not looking to formally be part of a campaign. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I hope, Andrew, if you're watching this, or more likely one of your 2 or 3 degrees of separation watching this, check out ubicenter.org. And Max seems like a pretty smart dude, and can add a lot to the conversation. So with you and Scott Santons and so many other great thinkers out there, we can really turn the corner, because it breaks my heart to see us spending, and it's going to be close to $5 trillion on all these stimulus programs. And I'm wondering, like, man, what would have happened had we had a basic income instead? Because that's not like messing around money. That's some serious dough that we've been printing. So, but let's keep the conversation going in the future, Max. And with that, we will say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds. Is that what?
Indeed. I didn't even have to tell you.
Okay.
I love it. Keep it real.